Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of Environmental History Worth Reading. I'm Sean Courage, one of the editors here at niche-canada.org, and I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I am the social media editor for Niche.
And you have been keeping an eye out on what people have been sharing online in the environmental history community, and you've picked 5 great items here for the month of October 2017. The first comes from The Atlantic, How the Benzene Tree Polluted the World.
Yes, this piece by Rebecca Altman was by far the most popular in October amongst environmental historians and very popular across the entire internet. And it's for good reason. It's a really good piece. It's very long, very thorough. She starts off by talking about linking PCB, or polychlorinated biphenyls, I think is what they are, to the Anthropocene, and talking about how PCBs are even being found in the bodies of dead deep sea creatures, which means that basically humans have infiltrated the entire world with their toxic byproducts. And this goes into the history of how we got to this point. She starts off by talking about PCB production in, I believe, Depression era Birmingham, Alabama, and how she, quote, talks about how they became ubiquitous while remaining anonymous during the 20th century, which leads up to eventually, I think, 1979. The U.S. Congress limits PCB production. She links it to Rachel Carson, etc. But then the post goes even deeper. It goes into the history of science, to the discovery of the benzene tree, to the isolation of the benzene molecule by German chemists in the late 19th century. And then she kind of builds up again, looking at how benzene was used in early industry and working her way back to the present. And it's just a really excellent piece of both scientific and environmental history. I highly recommend reading it.
Yeah, it was one of these like deep dive long reads, but a great example of public environmental history or popular environmental history in this big platform on theatlantic.com.
Yeah.
Your second pick takes us to the Anthropocene, a common thread in many of the videos that we've produced here. This one on pathogens in the Anthropocene.
Yes, this is on the Inhabiting the Anthropocene blog, which is a great blog. And these 2 particular posts are by Carl Harper. And he takes an interesting stance looking at the way that humans have changed the world for microbes, which is something that we don't necessarily think about. We don't think about our effects on the smallest parts of our ecological system. He starts off the first post by talking about an example from ancient Rome, which is the Antonine Plague, which I guess was brought to the Roman Empire by way of global trade. So something, again, that we don't necessarily think about, thinking way back in the past. And he talks about how that killed about 7 to 8 million people in the Roman Empire, thus having a pretty major effect on its future. And that's just an example that he uses to go into talking about the Anthropocene and microbial organisms in general, and how, from the point of view of a microbe, which is something we don't usually think about, humans have been changing the environment for millennia. He talks about DNA manipulation, the way that climate change is changing microbial environments, the reconfiguration of the human microbiome by the way that we are changing our diets, our way of our diets have evolved. And then in the second post, he dives more deeply into categorizing these ways that humans are changing the world for microbes, and giving examples of them. So he talks about, for instance, human habitats define germ habitats, how we transform biogeography, also how human health and the rise of medicine is basically a war on pathogenic microbes, and that's a big deal for them. So I just thought these 2 posts were really fascinating. very good read.
Yeah, and again, it's like an environmental history approach to thinking about pathogens ecologically and
Hmm.
their very close relationships to human history.
Yep.
You're over here with some disease and health history again here on
Yes.
Environment and Society portal, marshlands, sanitation policies, and epidemic fevers in late 18th century Barcelona.
Yes, this is by Kevin Pometti. And yeah, he's talking about the malaria epidemic of 1783 to 1786. And how he's looking at it is looking mainly at sanitation professionals and the way that sanitation proposals were put forward. And the main gist of his post is to look at the way that health professionals and physicians at the time actually did have a pretty good grasp of what was causing the epidemic of malaria. Before germ theory, of course, comes into play, but they still understand that it's due to the dirty water and the marshlands, etc. But the thing is that municipal authorities at the time didn't really take these physicians seriously.
Hmm.
So the post looks at some of the proposals that physicians brought forward through their medical reports at how to avoid these things in the future, and how these suggestions weren't necessarily put into effect. So good. I think it pairs well with
Yeah.
the last post as well. So
Yeah, and good to call out Environment and Society portal as well. Again, continues
yes,
to be an excellent resource for
yeah,
putting environmental history research on the web.
yes, definitely.
So then you shift gears a little bit over to think about sheep and their role in war in the American West.
Yes, I love this piece by Adam Sowards, and he argues, this is my favorite quote, is that conflict followed sheep like an invasive weed into the American West, and probably the Canadian West as well. He starts off by talking about the Trailing of the Sheep Festival, which is a festival in south central Idaho. I guess this was developed in the 1990s to help try to calm tensions between an increased recreational population in the area and the sheep herders who were there using the land as they had for decades, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even centuries. What he then talks about is how this is a conflict that kind of migrated from Europe to North America with the sheep. He talks about the ecological problems that come along with sheep herding, which reminded me a lot of books like A Plague of Sheep by
Mm-hmm.
Eleanor Melville. Um, and then he talks about some of the human conflict, how sheep herding was often up against cattle ranching in the West, and how these two agricultural industries were always competing for both labor and land, and how that led to range wars.
Hmm.
So basically, just a really interesting post. And the main gist of it is that you can't really understand the importance of this festival that takes place in modern day without understanding the conflicts in the past that have brought it into existence. So.
Yeah, it also reminds me of Virginia de John Anderson's Creatures of Empire, which
Yes.
looks at the eastern seaboard, Chesapeake, and New England, and the role of
Hmm.
domestic animals in conflict.
Yeah.
Your final piece deals with extinction and has a pretty nice picture of a bat.
Yeah, this is about the rougette, which was also known as the Mauritius flying fox. So yes, it's a species of bat that is now extinct, of course. And in this post, Matt Stanfield talks about the way that colonization of this island by the Dutch and then the French led to this extinction. So he talks about how once the French took over in 1710, they really intensified the sugar industry, also the institution of slavery, and how that impacted both the habitat of the island. So taking away the trees that these bats needed for their roosts, for living, obviously, and also how because the slaves were not treated properly, they actually turned to eating these bats. So that had an impact on the population. But the turn that's really interesting is how he describes in 1835 marked the emancipation of slavery. Of these slaves on the island, and that this free slaved community took up slash and burn agriculture, and that is what really put the nail in the coffin for these bats. So he talks about how by 1864 these bats were extinct. So I just thought it was a really interesting story of the impact of human intervention on animals. So.
A
Good
wonderful
stuff.
selection of picks, some animal history, some disease history, some history of chemicals, envirotech history, all of which can be found each month. Jessica does our monthly picks on environmental history worth reading. An excellent set, Jessica. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean.